So hello there and welcome to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 Podcast, a show where we take all of the latest news, gossip and events in the world of Formula One and we relay that back to you for your listening or viewing pleasure, depending on which platform you choose to follow us on. And it is the not Bahrain Grand Prix. I've already messed up the intro. 5 seconds in. Never mind. Ignore that. Ignore that. See, it sounds so professional. And then, bam, as soon as I think of where we're going.
Where'd that come from? Bahrain out of nowhere. You got, what's it called? TKO'd? You got TKO'd by Bahrain.
Yeah, pretty much. I've got it on the brain, Courtney. I was talking to our guest earlier about it. But anyway, let's crack on with it nonetheless, because our listeners will get bored of me monologuing. We're going to Azerbaijan, right? Got my notes? Yes, we're going to Azerbaijan. Apologies for that. And what a race we've got in store for us. If it's anything like the last couple of races that we've had, I'm pretty sure we're going to have plenty of talking points. 5 races into the season already, and we're already starting to see a potential critical moment in this season. But joining me on this episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast, as always, is the lovable and wonderful Mr. Courtney Pine. Courtney, how are you doing this sunny afternoon? Are you okay?
Yeah, you know what? Everything's going well. As you've stated, nice sunny afternoon. Bad weather if you're a penguin. Great weather if you're anyone else. But yeah, it's all good. I hope everyone else is doing well as well. Things are still looking up in the UK. And I just hope that everyone else around the world, if you're having troubles, we will get through this. So heads up, you will get there.
Absolutely. And of course, if we're helping in any way, then we're absolutely delighted to keep doing that for you. But of course, you would have also noticed joining us for the first time on the DNF1 F1 podcast is Ruby Price from Grid Talk via F1 Chronicle. Ruby, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. Absolute pleasure to have you. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm very good. Thank you very much for having me as well. I am, doing very good. Although it's getting closer to my much earlier than normal bedtime these days.
Yeah, we will try and keep this as brief as possible because I've said to Courtney, I've said to many of our viewers that are familiar with this podcast that sometimes I do go off tangent and very rarely come back in a timely manner. So anyway, I digress.
Just keep Ferrari out of the conversation. We'll be all right.
Well, that would be easier said than done if they weren't actually doing well this season. Last season, we could just cast that one to the memory bank. Said, no, we ain't talking about that. Let's forget them. But as I said, yeah, we'll keep that brief. If you are interested in learning a bit more about Ruby, you can check out her channel on YouTube, Ruby Price. And some great videos, some great vlogs as well that she does recording her everyday activities. So definitely check her out. I'll leave a link and description below to her and also leave a link and description to the Grid Talk podcast, which she hosts at the weekends. So now let's get on to the Azerbaijan Grand Prix in Baku this weekend. A scene that we obviously didn't go to last year owing to COVID, but it looks like we're going to be okay this time around to come back. And first things first, guys, we've got to talk about the championship situation now. After 4 races in Spain, it did seem like Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes had laid a huge glove on Red Bull to the point where they may not recover from. However, 2 weeks later in Monaco, they responded in a big way with Max Verstappen winning the race. Inherently, having the win made a bit easier for him owing to issues with Charles Leclerc before the race. And of course, Valtteri Bottas's everlasting pit stop, which eventually did come to an end on Tuesday afternoon last week. But of course, we'll get into that later. But I've got to say, guys, and I'll come to Ruby first on this one. What have you made to the start of the season so far, 5 races in?
I will say that it has been absolutely fascinating. And even the dull races, with the exception of Monaco, have been well worth watching. You know, there's always been something going on in them. And other than a temporary implosion, fingers crossed, touch wood, from Mercedes at Monaco, you know, there was always something happening. And, you know, it was just great watching so far this season.
You're absolutely right. And if I can ask, has there been a standout moment for you this season already?
I would, at this point, currently just say the strategy masterclass in Spain from Mercedes. You know, that just, for me, that's the definition that you get from Mercedes, just as much as possible on point with strategy calls. And, you know, that's where I think this season championship is going to be won, with someone calling the better strategy or someone deciding to go for a dodgy one that just doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I couldn't agree with you more that one would also be my personal favorite moment so far this season. Hopefully we're going to get plenty more like that. And of course, at Azerbaijan, it does tend to serve up the odd memorable moment. If we go back to 2017, the famous moment between Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton, where Seb got a little bit too hot under the collar, thinking Lewis outbraking him and then driving into him. Hopefully, I'd be very surprised if Seb's alongside Lewis behind a safety car in the race this weekend to do something similar. But I'm pretty sure they've made up and patched things up till then. But back to the overall championship situation at the moment. Now, Max Verstappen, for the first time in his career, now leads the championship, 4 points ahead of Lewis Hamilton after an abysmal weekend, as you mentioned earlier, Ruby. Obviously, Mercedes having all kinds of trouble, particularly with Lewis that weekend. Courtney, I'm going to ask you, as I've so often done on this show, is this moment that happened in Monaco, is it something that Lewis should really be worried about? Or do you feel that he would and Mercedes will just carry on as they've always done, learn from their mistakes, and then find the solution to put it all back together by the next race?
I think Mercedes are going to come into this race like a wounded animal. Whether that turns out to be a good thing or not, time will tell. But you can tell they're clearly hurting from how much of a disaster Monaco was. But at the same time, Mercedes have a real tendency to bounce back very efficiently from a bad weekend. And that's what's made them probably one of the best teams in Formula 1 history, is the way they can bounce back from a bad weekend. The debriefs are clearly harsh, but it works. So I'm expecting them to come back, but at the same time, I'm not expecting Max Verstappen to roll over for them.
No, that's a fair point. And Ruby, how would you feel regarding Courtney's statement there? Do you feel that Mercedes will respond like a wounded animal and learn from their mistakes emphatically? Or do you feel that perhaps this time around it might be a bit more difficult for them to pull that off as it was in previous seasons?
I think there is definitely an element of Mercedes that always involves that bounce back. You know, if you look back to pretty much any season over the last 7, whilst they have been the dominant force, if they have a bad weekend, the next weekend, things are always clinical. The difference is this time they are so closely matched by Red Bull for the time being, given all the talk about rear wings and front wings and stuff. And obviously, I think Red Bull have said that they still intend to use their controversial, to quote, rear wing this weekend. But yeah, Mercedes bouncing back every weekend has almost always been what we define Mercedes as. I think I said this about their strategy calls as well, but that's just what Mercedes have been, a well-oiled machine. And when a part goes wrong in one weekend, they replace that part for the next weekend, and all of a sudden they're topping the timesheets for the entire weekend.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And I think it's fair to say that over the course of this season, one thing that has stood out to me is that Mercedes have not necessarily gone for being the quickest team in practice at any circuit that we've been to. Yet they always turn the wick up. And when they do, they always seem to find a way, especially Lewis finding a way to get onto pole position. And I wouldn't be surprised if he pulled it off here. That being said, despite the fact that Mercedes tend to like it here in Azerbaijan, I think they've won 3 of the 4 races that we've had, with the exception being Daniel Ricciardo in the Red Bull. This track offers a wide variety of slow speed corners, which we've seen evidently Red Bull are very strong at, but also the long straights and the high speeds that it does experience in that final sector, where Mercedes tend to be stronger. When you sum that all up, Ruby, who would you say is going into this race feeling more confident about their car and their own performances? Would you say that'd be Mercedes and Hamilton perhaps? Or do you feel Red Bull will continue to feel confident as they did in Monaco?
I think Red Bull will be confident, and Red Bull being in the position that they are, you know, they're leading the championship for the first time since 2013 with both a driver and a constructor. If the momentum swinging their way after Monaco, but as we've mentioned, Mercedes, I think they will bounce back.
No, that's a good point. And do you feel that the strategy element that you've mentioned already, is that going to be the key factor again? Or do you feel that they might be able to extract even more performance out of the car this weekend?
Strategy is always interlinked with success in Formula One. You know, you can't win with bad strategies, but what Red Bull will be needing is Perez to, you know, be backing up Max Verstappen this weekend, as Mercedes will also be needing Bottas. You know, I've mentioned this on the preview for the month for the Baku Grand Prix for Grid Talk. You know, there's there's over 50 points between both drivers on each team. That doesn't show that your rear gunner is acting as a rear gunner. That's your rear gunner got left behind before you actually set off.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think it's fair to say that if pit stop issues were not taken into the equation, Bottas would have done his duties, at least as far as damage limitation was concerned for the Constructors' Championship. It wouldn't have had much of an impact on the drivers, probably the opposite, actually. But Perez's result, as well as him performing a great stint, did come in a large way owing to the efficient strategy of the team. Of course, the driver has to execute it in the same way that Lewis did in Spain, but Red Bull managed to get Perez out of a bit of a hole from qualifying and in the end did a very good job out of it. So you're right to point out that both rear gunner drivers do need to step up this weekend, despite what's happened already, because they are losing ground to their leading drivers. Courtney, I'm going to bring you into this conversation as well regarding the rear gunners that Ruby has already talked about. Perez got a very strong fourth position in Monaco. And as we said already, that a lot of this was owing to the performance of his team on strategy when it had to be. Do you feel that Perez is doing enough at the moment? Or do you feel that he has to find another gear to be more actively involved in this fight with Mercedes as his teammate is?
I think time will tell on that one. I think his performance in Monaco was very encouraging. And in the past, Adam, I think me and you have always been very vocal in our admiration for Sergio Perez. We've always felt that Sergio Perez deserves a chance in a big team. Red Bull's not the easiest team to go to. You look at some of the other drivers that have gone there, some very competent drivers that have struggled. So it's nothing against him. I think he can turn it around. It's just a matter of when, not if. But another thing, going back, I'd like to mention about Baku. I'm so glad that you mentioned the strategy element of this, because I think it's going to be so important. Because if you have a look at two parts of this track that will pretty much certain bring you safety cars. First of all, the castle section, which we've seen some high-profile crashes, and a couple of drivers we're seeing low down the grid. I think we can probably see an accident or two there. And also that long straight where you see some very experienced drivers misjudge the slipstream and then braking into turn one. So I'll be very surprised if we don't see safety cars mess up the strategy. And I think that's where the advantage will probably swing into Mercedes' favour.
Yeah, and the strategy is important to this race, and I feel like the rear gunners are going to have a huge role to play this weekend. I want to cast your mind back to 2018. Now, when it comes to strategy, Ferrari at that weekend looked very, very good. Vettel looked like he had the race in his pocket with Lewis struggling behind, but Bottas was in the mix as well. And cleverly, what Mercedes did was leave Bottas out on a very long one-stop strategy until a safety car fortunately came, which moved him into the lead of the race. Of course, we all know that he wasn't able to complete that because of tyre issues at the end, gifting the win to Hamilton. But that's just an example of how these support drivers or number two drivers in both teams can actually play a huge role, even if a situation arises where they win the race instead of, let's say Perez wins instead of Verstappen, but Hamilton is second, so you're kind of limiting the damage. It's those sort of facets in strategy that I think we have to consider, that both teams may have to be prepared to adopt to their own detriment in order to try and keep the championship as tight as it is. As I said, there's so many options that can be considered, but I think safety cars, Courtney, you're absolutely right in pointing out, are going to be critical for this race. Regarding Valtteri Bottas, obviously had a very, very difficult Monaco Grand Prix. Other than the unfortunate comments that Toto put out saying that Valtteri might have missed his pit stop marks, they were taken out of context. I think we can all agree it wasn't said in the way that it was Bottas's fault. It was just a part of a process that, in the same way as it was for the mechanic with the wheel gun, obviously not doing his job rightly or other things that go into place. But because of that, he lost out on a second place, which would have been thoroughly deserved. Qualifying was fantastic. It seems that no matter what happens with Bottas, it's very hard for him to complete a successful weekend, no matter what he does. Ruby, do you feel that Valtteri is on borrowed time at the moment on Mercedes? And if so, is that starting to really get to him on a mental side?
Well, what I do think for a start is that Bottas 2.0 needs a bit of a software patch, but it is a matter of Valtteri Bottas was hired back in 2017 to finish second to Lewis, while Lewis was winning. When Lewis was having an off day because even the, tied greatest of all time for championships can have an off day. Where that happens, Valtteri was supposed to be winning the race. And obviously back then, Mercedes were indomitable, let's say. But, what we've seen this season, obviously some of the circumstances haven't been his fault. He's got 2 DNFs, one from what I would consider a racing incident in Imola, one from a very 1 in a million freak accident that happened in a pit stop. But at the same time, he's finishing third in most of the races where he's on the podium with a Red Bull in front of him. That's not what Mercedes have got him there for. And with, so many drivers like Esteban Ocon in the wings and George Russell, Mercedes have got alternatives. And I think it wouldn't be out of the question to suggest that they will show up next season at the earliest.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And when you say that, I kind of think back to the early 2000s, efficient number 2 drivers backing up their lead driver, drivers like David Coulthard, McLaren supporting Mika Hakkinen, always doing his part to get ahead of Michael Schumacher in the Ferrari as and when he could, and more often than not was able to do that when they were successful in 98 and 99. Rubens Barrichello for Michael, in turn, for the early 2000s, was always there to make sure that any rival drivers couldn't take points off of Michael, etc. So you're absolutely right to point this out with Bottas. In the first 4 years at Mercedes, for most of the time, he's been able to do that. Mostly because the car's been so good, Valtteri's had that performance advantage to do that. But then you can't ask much more than him to come second to Lewis. This season, however, that's been a problem because, as you've mentioned, when Verstappen and Lewis are free of any issues or any troubles, they tend to finish 1 and 2. So the teammates aren't really doing their job in that effect to try and create a buffer between them. Courtney, I've asked you about this before with Bottas, but I'll bring this question up again. Based on what Ruby has said regarding Valtteri not really getting himself in that battle with Lewis and Max, do you feel that that's the only thing Valtteri can do to try and keep his seat for next year? Or do you feel that the writing is on the wall? And as Ruby said, George Russell in particular is already waiting for the call to get that contract for next season?
Well, yeah, he missed a real opportunity in Monaco. Let's be real here. He outperformed Lewis in Monaco. I don't know what happened to Lewis this weekend, but Valtteri was a better driver. But the trend we're probably seeing over last 2-3 seasons, that Valtteri tends to be closer to Lewis on a Saturday, and then Lewis just has a setup on a Sunday to overpower Valtteri with ease. Monaco was an opportunity for Valtteri to take advantage of the specifics of the track, and it ended in disaster. I feel that was the real opportunity for him. And in these coming races, yeah, as sad as it is, as unfortunate as what happened in Monaco is, the next few races are going to define Valtteri Bottas' future for sure.
Very well could do so. The summer break's obviously the time when a lot of these things get thrashed out. We've heard rumours that Red Bull are quite happy with Perez at the moment, and I believe he will be much more of a, how can I put it, much more of a force in the Red Bull team and much more useful, I suppose, to Max's championship chances. So contract talks might happen between them for next season, which is good for Perez if that is true. But let's talk about Max Verstappen. We haven't really mentioned him yet in this podcast episode. Leading the championship, getting a crucial win at Monaco, fighting back in the best way after the Spanish Grand Prix. It's fair to say that, in my opinion, that Max is doing a lot of good things this season to really convince us that he is a real force in this championship battle. We saw a great performance from him in Monaco. Yes, he inherited the win by virtue of Bottas not being able to challenge him in the second stint, and Charles Leclerc obviously losing that pole position by his own doing, it must be said as well, not to take anything away from Max. But all of that considered, Max put in the sort of drive that we've often said on this show that has eluded him throughout his career, and that's winning a race that he is the favourite, the heavy favourite to win, and delivering on that without any mistakes. Now that he's done that, does that convince either of you that Max has pretty much all of the tools that he needs to really take it to Lewis for the rest of the season? Ruby, I'll come to you first on that.
I do agree with everything you've said, but with that, one thing that I think Max does sort of lack in still, obviously, he's been in Formula One since 2016, and obviously got that Red Bull promotion. I think it was 2016 at least.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
he got that.
he got Red Bull in 2016. Yeah.
Yeah. He got that promotion very early in his career as well, and put into a top 2 team, top 3 occasionally, but top 2 very much. That certainly helps your career a lot. But the one thing that I think he's still sort of missing is that maturity and knowing when to pull out of a fight. We've seen how, I don't want to say argy-bargy, but like going into the first corner at several races this season, he's put his car in a 50-50 scenario. Obviously he knows that the competitor going into that first corner as well is someone else who's fighting for the championship, and Lewis Hamilton has in all of these occasions come off worse because of, I think in some cases it's more Lewis thinking, wait, I've got a championship fight to do, whereas it seems as though Max is, I need to be ahead at the first corner no matter what, and if I'm not, this race is over. And that's just one thing that I don't think Max Verstappen quite has yet, just that level of don't fight today, fight tomorrow.
Yeah, I can see Courtney nodding his head at this one, because we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. And I think Anthony Davidson made a really good observation in saying that Max Verstappen is very much driving like a younger Lewis Hamilton. And Lewis Hamilton today is battling against a younger version of himself. And I'm guessing, Courtney, you could probably weigh on this one as well, because I think a lot of what Ruby said is probably absolutely spot on.
Yeah, I mean, nothing against Max's ability. I mean, I think Max can beat Lewis over a course of a season with the right tools. I think it's possible. But the only doubt I have over Max is, I think we saw a couple of times last season when he had bad starts. If he was to have a bad start and he's coming up against drivers lower down the grid that aren't as able as the likes of like Lewis Hamilton, who's used to coming up against two at the front, is he going to tangle these cars and end up losing big points or crashing out altogether? I think we saw it. Where was it? Portimao last season, where he had a little bit of, he had like a mini engine failure at the start of the race. He got tangled up with the midfield teams and ended up going out himself. They're going to be the kind of moments that he's going to have to finesse, not get too hot-headed. He's going to finesse and think about that limitation, because I think that's one of the things where Lewis has really improved his racecraft. When he realises that Mercedes aren't as strong as he feels they should be, if they're like the third or fourth best team, he's really usually, 95% of the time, he's good at getting the best out of the car and getting the maximum points the car can get. And I think that's one thing Max needs to learn very quickly if he is to win this championship in particular.
Well, that's really interesting. And I'm going to play devil's advocate with this one, if I may, and ask you both the same question on this one of how this championship could go down. But based on what we've all been saying, Max is driving at the moment, not necessarily over aggressively, but in a manner which is putting the emphasis on the other driver to take somewhat of an evasive action in order for both cars to go through, and usually to their own detriment as Max goes through into the lead of the race. And with that in mind, do you both think that Max Verstappen knows that Lewis Hamilton is good enough and will take the evasive action almost every time Max drives over aggressively, to the point where he's doing it deliberately? And if he is, should Lewis change his tactics a bit to try and let Max know that he's not going to move out of the way from him every single time? Ruby, I'll ask you that one first.
That is a very good devil's advocate point. Max doing it on purpose because he knows that the other driver will move out of the way. And I think that Lewis knows what he's doing. But I would say that at some point you do have to show Max that, if you're going to put your car into dangerous situations, sometimes it will backfire and not work in your favor. But I don't think that would happen unless Lewis knows that there wouldn't be a championship repercussion from that situation. Because if you're just going to throw away a win, you need to make sure that so is your championship rival.
No, that's fair. And I mean, I asked because I feel like we're getting into another dynamic once again, where we saw with Nico Rosberg in 2016, and we saw a few years before that he was starting to put so much on the line because he felt like he had to do everything possible to beat Lewis. Every single 1% advantage he could get eventually added up to him being successful. I'm wondering if Max is doing the same thing, but perhaps going about it more subtly, than what Nico did. Courtney, I'm going to ask you the very same question. Is Max driving in a way where he knows Lewis is going to make some room for him to pull off these moves? And if so, does Lewis need to change his tactics and be a little bit more aggressive, like get the shoulders out a little bit more than he is?
I think up to this point, Max has been driving with that in mind. But what is interesting is that if Max continues to lead this championship, Max is then going to be the guy with something to lose, which is actually the last few years it's been the other way around. It's always been Lewis that's had something to lose. So it'd be interesting to see if Max continues with this approach if he does lead the championship, and that's where it will swing. Lewis will be the guy that will feel like he doesn't have as much to lose, and it'd be interesting to see how Max adjusts to this changing dynamic. Because look, we're talking facts here. Max isn't used to leading a championship, so yeah, it'd be very interesting to see how his racecraft changes from this point going forward.
And that's a really good point. We've got 18 races to go, and you can throw caution to the wind a little bit, not thinking about the bigger picture ahead as Max is doing. But eventually, if he keeps this up, there will come a point similar to like Seb Vettel did in 2018, despite the experience he had, knowing that there's a real chance that he could win the championship. And that moment in Germany where he made that mistake kind of unfolded him for the rest of the season. Max, we haven't seen yet how he's going to react in that sort of situation, but there could come a point where he may feel that his season hinges on a specific moment. And if there's any remorse or regrets in him, that may come out in his driving. We'll have to wait and see, of course, but it certainly is looking like an exciting prospect this weekend. Let's move away from the main talking point. It seems that we have 4 different battles going on this season. We have Mercedes, Red Bull, we have McLaren, Ferrari, we have Aston Martin, Alpine, and trying to remember the other team in this one. This is terrible.
Haas one around the bottom.
No, I was thinking AlphaTauri, sorry. It's terrible. You've got so many teams with similar names. I kind of skipped my mind trying to remind myself. But then you've got the battle at the back, as you pointed out, Courtney, between Haas, Williams, and Alfa Romeo. Let's go to McLaren and Ferrari now. And I think the only place that we can start with McLaren is Lando Norris, who once again put in a stellar performance to get probably an unlikely podium at Monaco. But nonetheless, he pulled it off, took advantage of issues happening to drivers ahead of him. And it never really seemed in doubt after a while. Ruby, I've got to ask you on this because we've praised Lando Norris so much this season. How good is Lando driving right now? Do you feel pound for pound he's driving as well as Lewis and Max are at the moment?
Yeah, it annoyed me that Lando was the McLaren driver on the podium because I predicted it would be Daniel Ricciardo given his previous win.
I remember, yeah.
Yeah, but no, Lando Norris is just putting in a performance that I think is absolutely going to define his career as of yet. You know, we still don't know how good the McLaren's going to be in the next year, but we don't know about that for any of the cars, with maybe the exception for one of them based on how they're performing this season. But yeah, Lando Norris just is showing every reason this season, and as well a little bit last season, as to why McLaren are putting so much faith in him. You know, he signed a multi-year contract already with McLaren. He wants that he wants that relationship to continue. They want that relationship to continue. And if he keeps putting in performances like the ones he's been doing, he could have been on pole in Imola if it hadn't have been for a couple of inches. I didn't think I'd be saying that about McLaren after 2017.
No, you're absolutely right to point that out. And it's such a huge rise in trajectory for McLaren. I mean, we're all old enough and follow the sport enough to know the good days when McLaren were at the front of the field, and this was not a surprise to so many fans. But there are so many younger fans coming into the sport, probably would have been around the time McLaren Honda re-engaged their partnership in 2015, obviously was not very successful, and McLaren were facing the barrel of the gun at the back of the field. Very foreign territory for them. And to see the rise that they've had in the last 5 or 6 years has been remarkable, to the point now where it's very realistic to imagine them being at the very front of the field as early as next season, assuming all goes to plan from their side. Lando seems to be at the heart of that. And he has been for a good couple of years now, of course, with Carlos Sainz doing well for them before he's moved to Ferrari. You raised a good point about his contract. Obviously wanted to continue that partnership with McLaren, having signed a new multi-year deal in line, we believe, with what Ricciardo has to 2024. But with Lando's stock rising at the rate that it is at the moment, do you feel that perhaps was a bit too early to sign a deal like that with McLaren, or do you, with the idea of perhaps other teams like Red Bull and Mercedes looking at Lando maybe for the future? Or do you feel that it was wise for Lando to sort of cash in whilst the contract is right there in front of you?
I think it's a similar situation to Charles Leclerc, who obviously got the longest contract that Scuderia have ever offered a driver. You know, they both know that the teams are on their way back up. You know, Ferrari had a very catastrophic season last season. McLaren had a tumultuous relationship with two different engine suppliers and have returned to Mercedes, of which to me feels a bit more like the norm, given I joined my interest in this sport whilst they were a Mercedes powered team. But yeah, you do raise a good point that maybe, you know, with so many, well, I say so many, with the two teams ahead of them having drivers whose contracts might be, you know, in question, Norris signing for McLaren for so many years is both a risk and also just him having faith in the team that they will deliver.
Yeah, absolutely right. And of course, you know, I say this with the mindset that with so much uncertainty regarding those two teams that it may have been an opportunity missed by Lando, but then he knows what he's got at McLaren. He knows what they can provide him. And I'm sure he's as confident as anybody that McLaren could give him a championship winning car in the next few seasons, maybe next season, we'll never know. Courtney, as I said, we've often sung Lando's praises, particularly this season. And, you know, there's not much more that we can say that we haven't already said. But I will ask you the question for this weekend. Will Lando be able to keep this form up for McLaren? Or do you feel that perhaps he's driving beyond his current ability at the moment?
I'm going to put it out there. I think he could possibly win this race. Right, for two reasons. First of all, we saw how well the McLaren performed in Monaco. And there are parts of this circuit which are obviously street circuit specific. Add that with a Mercedes engine, they're going to be powerful along the long straight. And in Baku, we've seen some high-profile incidents involving the front runners. So if we have one of those races where the front runners crumble, I feel that Lando Norris is the Daniel Ricciardo of 2017, 2018. When the front runners crumble, he's there to pick up the pieces. So if that was to happen again, you'd have to put Lando Norris as a favourite to win the race.
Well, he's certainly performing to a level that wouldn't surprise many if he ended up being in that position to sort of see it through. Of course, it would be a brilliant thing to see. Whether that happens this season or not, we'll have to wait and see, but it's certainly not out of the question. As a side note, before we go on to Ricciardo, obviously Lando was part of the UK punditry team watching the Indy 500. I wasn't sure if either of you watched the Indy 500 at the weekend. The race obviously won by Helio Castroneves, the fourth time he's won that race. So congrats to him on that one. It was actually quite enjoyable to watch that. I don't often watch the Indy 500, but I'm definitely going to make that a thing to watch in future years. As a side note, they asked Lando if he would be interested in driving in the Indy 500 one day. He seems to be leaning more towards Le Mans and then perhaps going into Indy when he's much older. Is that something you'd like to see Lando do in the future? Perhaps have a go at the Indy 500? Ruby, I'll ask you first.
I mean, it's always nice seeing F1 drivers cross-pollinate, to use a metaphor. You know, Formula E is very much sort of like the AEW of Formula One, in that a lot of drivers graduate F1 and then, because they're still pretty high profile names, you know, you've still got Jean-Eric Vergne around because Formula E gave him a platform to be in. You know, just because someone leaves our sport doesn't mean that has to be the end for them. And it would be nice to see, you know, people like Lando, people like George Russell, the nice, in inverted commas, like nicely perceived drivers, still having some success afterwards.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And of course, for you wrestling fans out there that would appreciate Ruby's metaphor there, it's always an interesting dynamic, because I think we look at the Formula One drivers as the best drivers in the world in terms of open wheel racing. And of course, some of them do migrate into Indy racing. We've had Romain Grosjean quite famously this season coming second at the Indy Grand Prix, very nearly winning that. Marcus Ericsson has been there a few years now. Juan Pablo Montoya, who of course did well at the Indy 500 in the top 8 this weekend. So many great names and so many famous drivers. But I suppose the caveat is that Indy racing, it's not as easy to jump into as it used to be. I mean, I think of the example of Nigel Mansell winning the F1 World Championship, and then the very next season in '93, going to Indy racing and then winning the championship first time out. I don't expect a Formula One driver to go, or let's say Lewis Hamilton. He could do that if he wanted to, and maybe he'd probably have a good go at it. But I don't think it's as straightforward as perhaps it used to be in the '90s. With respect to because there are some great drivers in Indy racing, they really are, especially some of the speeds they were traveling at this weekend. Courtney, I'll ask you as well. Is the Indy 500? Is that something you'd like to see Lando have a go at, and how would you think he'd get on if he'd had a go at it?
Of course, I'd like to see him do it. I think it all depends on where his career goes. I think if you're going to be a front runner driver, consistently challenging for championships, I don't think you can be distracted by other motorsport events throughout a season. So I'm in two minds about it, because I want to be seeing Lando at the top of Formula One. But if unfortunately for whatever reason he isn't, I would like to see him competing in other sports, because Formula One drivers have shown traditionally that they can do well in Indy 500. They can do well in Le Mans, for example. And it's always a dream for drivers to be winning in these multiple categories. So, yeah, I think it's already been stated. If a driver doesn't make it to the very top of Formula One, it isn't the end of the world for their career. But ideally, for any driver, really, they want to showcase their talents in multiple disciplines, really.
Yeah, and I think you're right to point out you can't just jump into it. It does require some level of work and dedication. Fernando Alonso, of course, had to dedicate a lot of time to the Indy program just to compete in one race. Obviously, trying to complete that Triple Crown. It might be a while before we see Fernando back in that race, if ever, maybe the next 2 or 3 years. But it's just an example that perhaps is something that F1 drivers might look at later in their careers if, of course, they're not successful here. But it's always fun to think about, and you never know, maybe we will see Lando at the Indy 500. I'll certainly be keeping an eye out for him if he does. Let's move on to the other side of the garage now. Daniel Ricciardo, very much a contrast this season to compared to his teammate Lando. I think two things worth pointing out here. One, I don't think Ricciardo was expecting Lando to be so good in this car. I don't think many people were, to be fair, which obviously hasn't helped his situation. But at the same time, it does seem, even still now, particularly at the Monaco Grand Prix, that the car seems to be driving Ricciardo more than he's driving the car. Ruby, I've got to ask you regarding Daniel Ricciardo, how much do you feel that he actually is struggling to get on top of this car? And do you feel he's going to be able to get on top of it soon?
Well, I've heard that McLaren are giving Daniel Ricciardo a new chassis from this race weekend, which does suggest that he has been struggling. And Ricciardo himself, he's shown previously that he has pace and he can win in a car that's not the best on its day, but also that, when he's, driving in a car that's not necessarily the best, he can get a good performance out of it. We've seen him on podiums in the Renault from last season, which in some cases was absolutely nowhere, but in other cases, he was wrestling it around corners at speeds, you just think, no, not in that car, pull out. And then, so Daniel Ricciardo in the preseason looked like the strongest McLaren driver, but as soon as the racing situation started happening, just wasn't quite gelling with the car at all.
And of course, returning to the venue where he won in 2017 for Red Bull, perhaps this could be a weekend where Daniel might be able to get on top of that McLaren, wouldn't you say?
Well, I said that about Monaco, but who knows? Maybe the familiarity of it will help, and just the fact that it is sort of a bit like Monaco, but with some features exaggerated, maybe that could help a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably exaggerated features, as you said, like the back straight, which could help McLaren with the Mercedes engine. Let's not forget that is going to be very handy for them, especially when they're pretty handy at slower speed corners. But hopefully for Daniel, he will be able to get on top of that. Courtney, the same questions to you. Do you feel this weekend has to be a weekend that Daniel shows some level of progress in this McLaren, or do you feel that they just got to keep being patient and he will eventually find his feet?
He's going to have to start turning it around pretty soon, because we're going into a stage of the season where races start coming thick and fast. And before you know it, you're towards the end of the championship. So we're going into a vital phase of the championship for pretty much every single driver on the grid. So for somebody that's been struggling like Daniel Ricciardo, he has to turn it around. But at the same time, as Ruby's already stated, and we have various times in the past, if anybody can turn it around, it's Daniel Ricciardo. I think it's a little bit unfair to compare him directly to Lando Norris, because Lando Norris has been exceptional this season. So we don't want to take anything away from Lando. I think even if Daniel gets much closer to Lando, that'd be a good thing for the team. I don't expect Daniel to overtake Lando at any point this season. I think the main aim for him this season is to get the grips with this car enough, sort of consolidate this season, and then prepare for next season, because with the big regulation changes coming along, it's going to be a big opportunity for a lot of drivers. And I think Daniel just needs to get himself comfortable within that team and make himself nice and refreshed for next season.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think we're entering this dynamic now, similar to Red Bull and Mercedes, where McLaren and, of course, Ferrari, who we'll get onto in a minute, they have this issue with both their drivers where they need them both to be scoring points week in, week out for the overall battle in the Constructors' Championship. They're almost deadlocked, 2 points separating them in McLaren's favour. And unlike Ferrari, McLaren do need to find ways to get Ricciardo to be able to contribute and score more points and feel more comfortable with this car. So perhaps, as Ruby pointed out, with this new chassis, maybe that will do the trick, or at least catapult him further up the field, because he performed well in Spain. He was the better of the two McLarens there, but of course, you've got to make sure that that's a regular occurrence. Let's talk about Ferrari. And Ferrari very much with their tails up at the moment, at least on one side of the garage following what happened in Monaco. But the pace of the car is evident for everyone to see. It's certainly not on the level of the Red Bull and Mercedes, but there are facets of that car which are propelling them up to the field, at least fighting with McLaren for the best of the rest. So those two seem to be in a class of their own compared to everybody else in the field behind the top two. Ruby, I've got to ask about Carlos Sainz. We were talking about number two drivers in this situation, but I feel like Carlos Sainz, more than any other number two in any team, is really delivering race by race at the moment. How impressed have you been with Carlos Sainz and how he's adjusted to his new team this season?
I mean, it speaks volumes that the two drivers have got 40 points and 38, and Carlos Sainz is one of the few drivers this season to have gone to a different team. But he's just switched on immediately and gelled with that Ferrari team, which we know from being involved in Formula One. Ferrari is not a team that you can just up and go to and, immediately show up. It even took Charles Leclerc a couple of races to actually show that, hey, I'm in Ferrari and Ferrari have chosen me for a reason, with the exception of a heartbreaking Bahrain result. But yeah, seeing Carlos Sainz, who, whilst at McLaren was one of my favorite drivers that have driven for McLaren, it's so good seeing him being up at that level where he has to perform if he wants to stick around in Ferrari as well.
Yeah, absolutely right. And Courtney, with Carlos Sainz so far, is there going to get to a point this season, if he keeps performing at this level, where he may want to stake a claim to battling Charles Leclerc for supremacy in that team? Or do you feel that at the moment he's just happy to be improving every week and just delivering where Ferrari want him to?
I think a lot of it comes down to the performance of the car and where they are in the pecking order. I think we saw it during Carlos Sainz's days at McLaren. They were probably outperforming their own expectations, so it's very easy for the two drivers to get along. So I think this season, if Sainz is picking up similar points to Charles Leclerc, that won't be a problem. It'd be seen as a good thing. But if we were to move on to next season and the Ferrari is going for the championship, we'll be seeing a very different dynamic between their two drivers.
Absolutely. Similar to what we saw between Charles Leclerc and Vettel, of course, not for a championship, but that battle for supremacy, if you like, between the two of them, which of course manifested in more than a few occasions where they did come together, much to the detriment of their own team. Hopefully, Ferrari will be hoping that doesn't repeat itself, at least in 2022. But Ferrari had a very strong weekend at Monaco, stronger than probably almost anybody imagined, perhaps anyone that was outside Ferrari. Obviously, they felt very confident, although they did keep quiet about it for as long as they could. Do we feel that with this track having some similar characteristics, particularly the slower speed corners, are we expecting Ferrari to be fighting Mercedes and Red Bull again this weekend? Or do you feel that they're going to fall back to fighting McLaren and hoping to pick up the pieces if the front two teams fall away? Ruby, I'll ask you that one first.
I do think it would be a bit of a stretch to imagine Ferrari fighting the Mercedes and the Red Bulls for the win this weekend, just given the straight line speed element that you also need in Baku. That long straight is where we're going to see almost every piece of overtaking this weekend, maybe a couple elsewhere on the circuit, but you need to be going the fastest that your car can possibly go and then some to stay ahead of a car behind you with DRS on that straight. With the exceptions of maybe just leaving it a little bit on the inside at the first corner. But Ferrari fighting McLaren is something that I always enjoy seeing in F1. It's what happened when I joined the sport. And, it's at least nice seeing them fighting each other. I just don't think at the minute that, well, with this weekend especially, we're going to see Ferrari fighting for number one.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel exactly the same regarding that, purely simply because, as you mentioned, the long straight at the final sector, Ferrari, there've been many reports saying that Ferrari's down on power to Mercedes, at least by about 20 horsepower, which is a lot more than people consider it to be. Doesn't seem much considering these cars churn out over 1,000 horsepower, but it is still quite a lot. And as you said, I think that is going to be a decisive factor, particularly when we have a big DRS zone in that area, one of the biggest of the season. Courtney, do you agree with Ruby's comments on Ferrari, or do you feel perhaps Ferrari should be continuing to feel a little bit more buoyant about their prospects for this weekend?
I think unless they bring a monster-style rear wing to that Ferrari, I think they're going to be sitting ducks on that straight. I think it doesn't matter how well you do in the cornered sections in sector 1 and 2. I just feel that as you've already stated, with the big DRS advantage as well, I just feel that if any car behind them has the sort of the slightest advantage over Ferrari at that point, they are just going to be sitting ducks. So I think Ferrari will be doing a lot of head scratching, thinking about how they're going to set up their cars in order to minimise the risk of them being overtaken. But I could see it being a long weekend for them.
Yeah, I mean, there's always that to consider. And I think when it comes to Ferrari's engine, they've said that they've caught up to Renault, but still struggle behind and maintain the gap to Honda, although they're still behind them. And of course, closed a little bit to Mercedes, but the gap is still there between them. So it will be important for Ferrari to get track position, I think, in qualifying. My only concern, as you mentioned, Courtney, in the race, they could potentially be sitting ducks in the DRS section. That being said, I still feel McLaren will be the only team in my mind, other than, of course, the top two will be ahead of them, that will really give them second thoughts over the race. Because I think everyone else behind them, there is definitely a margin or a gulf, if you like, between McLaren and Ferrari, and of course the next three teams in the midfield, which we'll get onto in a moment. A few quick words on Charles Leclerc, if we can. Of course, Saturday, despite the controversy around how he managed to secure pole position, it was an incredible lap that Charles Leclerc put together to get on pole. But of course, the race, by his own doing, didn't go according to plan, wasn't able to start, once again, adding to the woes that he's experienced in his home circuit. How will he be feeling going into this race? Do you feel that he will be trying to claw back points that he lost and perhaps being a bit more aggressive? Or do you feel he's going to be more like the methodical approach he's taken the first 4 races this season before Monaco and just put in another performance that we expect from Charles? Ruby, I'll ask you first.
Yeah, I mean, Charles knows that he had every chance of winning that Monaco Grand Prix, his home circuit, which is arguably potentially one of the reasons as to why he had such a turn of pace. Like, we saw that the Ferrari was fast in Monaco, but we also saw that Charles took pole, and you don't take pole without having the pace on your lap in that specific moment. But, he's got a point to prove. People were saying that he deliberately crashed to stop other drivers taking pole from him, and he'll want to silence those people. He's as we've said, I don't think he's going to get on pole this weekend. I don't think he's going to win this weekend, but he wants a haul of points that he lost for definite.
You have to tell me who these people are, Ruby, after we finish recording. I want names and addresses so I can send them a strongly worded letter as to why they're wrong on that one. But yeah, but as I said, controversial moment aside, it is a big weekend for Charles. And so far this season, he's been very, very good. Him and Lando Norris have definitely been 2 of the stars so far. But of course, that Monaco incident, by his own doing, will have set him back a little bit. and he will need to, recover, put it to one side and just get on and do the job that he's been doing for the other 4 races this season. Courtney, I've just said that as if that's very, very easy to do. We know with Charles Leclerc that he's had races where he's been brilliant, but he's always got that error in him, or that moment where perhaps he loses concentration or gets a little bit ahead of himself and makes a mistake, which ends him up into the barrier at the swimming pool section. Or 2 years ago, last time we're at Baku, when he had the car to be on pole, ended up crashing into the wall at turn 8. What sort of Charles Leclerc do you think we're going to get this weekend?
I'm not too worried about him being affected by Monaco. I think if you have a look through Charles Leclerc's history on the human level, he's had to deal with a lot of adversity. He's lost a lot of, he's lost his dad, he's lost close friends of his in Jules Bianchi and Hubert in a couple of years ago in Spa. So I think in terms of dealing with adversity, he's had to fight back on the personal level. He's come back from worse situations in Monaco, let's be honest here. So I don't think Charles Leclerc struggles with dealing with these kind of situations. Yes, he does have the mistake in him, but I think he's probably one of the drivers compared to most of the others that can turn it around after having a bad weekend.
Yeah, that's always a good point. And, this is another example. I think we will see Charles Leclerc show others why he should be considered in the upper echelons, at least as far as the driver pecking order is concerned. So hopefully a better weekend for him, and Ferrari continue as they have been doing so far. It's certainly proven to be exciting between them and McLaren. So let's move on to the other 3 teams in the midfield. Now, of course, I'm aware of time, so we're going to be trying to move these along as quick as we can. But let's start with Aston Martin. Now, Aston Martin, despite what a lot of people were saying, including myself at Monaco, they put together a really, really strong weekend, the best that they've done this season, and could end up being their highlight of the season. Ruby, were you happy to see Sebastian Vettel get on top of the Aston Martin for the first time? And is this a sign that perhaps Seb is starting to feel more comfortable with the car and we'll see this sort of performance from him in a few races to come? Or do you feel that they're going to revert back to where they've been the first 4 races this season?
I believe that Monaco very much closed the gaps between a lot of teams, allowing for, the shock results that we saw in the weekend, but I have to hold my hands up and say that it was a good strategy from Aston Martin to, pull off Sebastian Vettel, getting past both the Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton and Pierre Gasly in the AlphaTauri in one pit stop. Obviously going long was the strategy for the weekend, and they pulled that off. But, I think next weekend in Baku, we are going to see more of a gap between the teams, and particularly with the Aston Martin, the AlphaTauri and the Alpine being so close, and the Aston Martin being a team that don't necessarily understand their own car, I do think we will see them going backwards a little bit at least.
And would that be the same for Lance Stroll? Because, he's gone about his business quite well and has inadvertently become the meme of the season already, owing to some shoddy camera work by the TV director at Monaco. Do you feel that that's going to be the same for him as well?
Lance Stroll has been quietly just picking up points every now and then, which, it explains as to why he's had, why all the focus has been on Sebastian Vettel underperforming. But it just shows as well how only occasionally it's been picking up a couple of points, that Vettel's got 1 point finish and has gone ahead of him in the championship.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. And hopefully that continues for him, because I've certainly been singing his praises as well. Courtney, what do you make of Aston Martin's prospects this weekend? Do you see Vettel continuing to refine that form that he showcased in Monaco? And what do you think about Lance Stroll's chances?
I'm in 2 minds, really, because you look at their performance in Monaco and you're not sure whether their performance was down to the car itself or the fact that you can't overtake. So it'd be interesting to see where they are in race trim in the first 2 sectors. But let's not forget they do have a Mercedes engine, so that is going to give them a level of advantage over the teams that are usually closer to them. So it all depends. It all depends how they deal with the first 2 sectors, because they should, in theory, depends how they set up the car. In theory, they should be strong in that final sector. So this could be another opportunity for Aston Martin to do better than they usually expect to.
Well, of course, let's not forget in the slower corners at Baku in the first two sectors, as we saw in Monaco, Vettel was able to get into Q3. So there might be some pace, at least in the slower corners, where the Aston Martin could, qualify higher up the grid as well. We'll have to wait and see, but it really hangs in the balance with them. Can they repeat their heroics, or will it be more of the status quo that we've seen earlier this season? Speaking of teams that have had a difficult status quo, let's talk about Alpine, who they were pretty strong for the last couple of weeks, but Monaco, not so much. Ruby, what do you make of Alpine's prospects for this weekend? And what do we do about Fernando Alonso? What is going on with him at the moment?
Yeah, that young prospect, Fernando Alonso, who took part in the, young drivers training. Yeah, it's an interesting one with Alpine, because obviously last season they were, as Renault, they were very strong and were contenders in the final race of the season for third place in the championship, but it just didn't work out for them in the end because of two very strong performances from Racing Point, Aston Martin and McLaren. But I think this weekend, if we do see a strong performance from Alpine, it's more likely to come from Esteban Ocon, who, is very comfortable in that team. He's very comfortable in that car. And at this point in the season, is pulling out the better performances than his much more experienced teammate, Fernando Alonso.
Yeah, absolutely right. And of course, you say the young driver, that guy looked about 40. I don't know about you. But Courtney, yes, Ruby pointing out that Esteban Ocon has, without doubt, been the star for Alpine this season, probably going against what a lot of people expected.
Including us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we felt that Alonso was going to do okay, nothing spectacular, more because the car wasn't there. But after pre-season testing, the signs did suggest that Alonso was definitely in the ballpark, at least as far as the fight for the best of the rest. And Ocon was not really anything spectacular, but all of a sudden, Ocon is proven to be the real talisman in this team, whereas Fernando Alonso may have to start thinking about is there anything he can do to get back to where he feels he should be?
Well, again, Fernando's one of those drivers that we just spoke about. Dan Ricciardo earlier on. He's one of those drivers that needs to turn it around in this phase of the season. Easier said than done. I know. I expect Ocon to outperform Fernando again, but I do expect Alpine to have a quiet weekend. Given the performance that we've seen recently and the power of the Renault engine, yeah, I expect a quiet weekend from them, to be honest.
No, that's fair. You're probably right to point that out. They seem to have at least as good an engine as Ferrari. Maybe as far as the electrical unit, it might not be as good. Obviously, we don't know. We only hear these reports all the time, but the evidence does suggest that they are lacking in that area in particular. And this could be a track where that will be exposed more than most. AlphaTauri, it's a bit strange with AlphaTauri at the moment because we're expecting so much more from them, at least from what pre-season testing and barring qualifying had us believe that they were capable of. But the other teams have really stolen a march on them, at least as far as the midfield battle is concerned. And I've got to say, despite showing some brilliant performances, not just this season, but last season, Pierre Gasly kind of finds himself in a bit of a catch-22 at the moment with AlphaTauri, not necessarily because of the car, but also his future as well. So, Ruby, is there anything that he can do regarding his future, or is the AlphaTauri just not going to be good enough for him at the moment?
The only thing I think that Pierre Gasly can do is just continue being consistent. He's in a car that is very much a side project. It's not designed to win races. It has done on 2 occasions, him being one of them. But, if he wants to go to a better team, it's not going to be his decision at the end of the day. It's going to be, Alpine's decision if they want to get a second French driver. It's going to be, Aston Martin seemed to be locked down for several years, and I wouldn't want to go to Alfa Romeo, Williams, or Haas at the minute. So, he's stuck in the AlphaTauri unless Alpine want to take a chance on him.
And that seems to be the concern at the moment, because we've said Alpine seemed to be the logical destination at the start of the season. But because of Esteban Ocon's upturn in form, that door seems to have been slammed shut. As far as we understand, Ocon could be staying there for a few more years to come. Is there any opportunity for Gasly anywhere in Formula One, or do you feel that perhaps Red Bull may want Gasly out of that AlphaTauri seat with the host of young drivers that they've got coming through F2?
Yeah, the problem Red Bull have done, but by virtue of other drivers leaving, Ricciardo leaving in 2018 very much shook them up, as did Vettel leaving back in 2015 or the end of 2014, start 2015. Red Bull have exhausted half of their young driver academies. To the extent that we saw people like Brendan Hartley being given a chance, and them having to bring back Danny Kvyat, who did put in some very good performances, but at the same time, Red Bull's program hasn't worked more recently. Which is why they brought in Sergio Perez from Aston Martin Racing Point. Pierre Gasly is in a one-way street with a dead end ahead of it, unless, like I say, someone else wants to pick him up. And why would Alpine take what currently is their, good formula?
No, it's absolutely right. And I suppose we should also mention Yuki Sonoda. And this feels like a bit of a repetitive question at the moment, because for the last couple of weeks, I've mentioned that Yuki looked so promising in preseason testing. I followed him in F2 and he was absolutely superb. I'm convinced if the season had gone on a bit longer, he would have been challenging Schumacher and Callum Ilott for that F2 title. But for whatever reason, despite being Formula One's new pocket rocket, he has shown a lot of the unamiable qualities of an F1 driver, in that he's been very loud on the radio, been very frustrated, saying things in the heat of the moment and then having to retract them afterwards, which of course doesn't make the problem go away, and really not delivering where the performance that the car is capable of for one reason or another. In your mind, Ruby, what do you think Yuki Tsunoda needs to do to try and turn that around?
Well, the first thing that he very much needs to do is find some consistency. He's had some very up and down races over the last couple of weekends, and his current star performance was Bahrain, more specifically pre-season testing, but getting some points on his debut race was certainly helpful. But after that, it's just been a bit of a sweary mess from Yuki Tsunoda, and he just needs to get some more experience. At the end of the day, he is still a rookie, and is one of the higher performing rookies that we've got on the grid this season. But when the other rookies are in a car from last season, you'd hope to be leading that race, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. But it doesn't look like it on paper. Of course, we're looking at it from a what's the right word? We're kind of trying to average it up at the moment, and he's certainly not performing to the level that some of the other rookies are, by contrast. Courtney, I'm going to bring you into this conversation with AlphaTauri. Of course, we've just talked about Gasly and Sonoda, but Ruby made a very interesting comment in that AlphaTauri have traditionally been a bit of a side project, or a junior team, if you like, to Red Bull. This season in particular, they refused to take certain listed parts from the Red Bull, particularly the rear end and the rear wing, of course. They decided to go their own route about it and focus on the front of the car and keep the 2020 car at the rear. Is that starting to prove to be a bit of a mistake, considering how much further Red Bull have improved, and by the virtue of what we're seeing this season, how much AlphaTauri have kind of regressed in the midfield?
Well, yeah, it is proving to be a mistake. Because it just shows that it's very easy going into a new season with your own ideas, but that development throughout the course of a season, that's what we're seeing. We've been seeing AlphaTauri slip back race after race, slowly but surely slipping further and further away. And this is a result of them not having that collaboration with Red Bull when it comes to development. So, yeah, the way it's going at this point, yeah, we're only 5 or 6 races in, but at this point, it is looking like a mistake.
And, talking about regressing into the midfield and almost becoming F1's forgotten team, or certainly I almost forgot them earlier.
One of them anyway, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Gasly and Sonoda, very much contrasting in terms of how they're performing at the moment. But all the same, it seems that Gasly, as we've already said, may end up becoming F1's forgotten man at the moment, and is there anything that he can do to change that?
I'm seeing problems for both of these drivers. I think for Gasly, all he can do is get the best out of that car, because if you're in a forgotten entity, which is the AlphaTauri this season, all he can do is get a couple sort of eye-catching results out of nowhere, similar to what we saw with Sebastian Vettel in Monaco. It's out of nowhere, got a good result, and all of a sudden people are talking about him again. That's what Pierre Gasly needs to do for the rest of the season. If we move on to Yuki Tsunoda, I feel he's got so wrapped up in what the media and what some of the fans think about him with his comments on the radio. He's actually forgetting about the most important thing, which is his racecraft. Stop worrying about, control your language. You know, it is important when you're in a elite sport like this. But I think that's letting him distract himself from his actual mentality when it comes to driving, because he has proven in F2 and in moments in F1 already that he is a competent driver. I think he just needs to let go of those external pressures, focus on his racing, then the rest of it will start coming together for him again.
Well, they certainly hope so, because I think both of them definitely need some upturning fortunes, one more for different reasons than the other, but it's certainly not an easy time for them. We'll quickly touch on the last few teams now. Alfa Romeo had a very good weekend at Monaco. The car looked quick, the drivers looked quick, and Giovinazzi got into the points. Ruby, first of all, how were you surprised that Alfa Romeo managed to score a point at Monaco, and were you even more surprised it was Giovinazzi rather than Raikkonen?
I mean, given that Giovinazzi wrecked 2 Saubers when he was deputizing for Pascal Wehrlein back in whenever it was, seeing the consistency that he's been growing from, that's certainly something. And I do think at this point, Alfa Romeo should maybe be looking at keeping Giovinazzi a little bit more long-term than just as a requirement to keep a sponsorship. But yeah, I was surprised to see them pull off a point, but I was expecting them to be fighting around, P11 to P13. But sealing that point, obviously, maybe just came from there being less drivers up front. But, you've got to be in those positions to get them.
Well, no, that's a really interesting point that you made regarding his position in that team, because as far as we understand, he is the driver that Ferrari elect to put in that team. And Ferrari have traditionally had one seat in that Alfa Romeo car. Even in the Sauber days, they've always had that for the best part of 20 years. And with Giovinazzi, he faces the uphill battle of not just performing in his own team and beating Raikkonen, but doing enough to keep the likes of Callum Ilott, Robert Schwartzman, Marcus Armstrong, all in F2, and more importantly, not in his seat. And whilst I'm expecting Théo Pourchaire, who coincidentally won the F2 race at Monaco, the feature race, to be in that car next season, being the Sauber reserve driver, is there anything in your mind that you feel Giovinazzi can realistically do performance-wise to stay in that seat? Or do you feel perhaps it's inevitable that a 27-year-old that, as you said, has sponsorship offerings to the team and, of course, is a Ferrari driver, might be also on borrowed time for this season?
Well, one thing that I do think will make a big impact is Giovinazzi obviously got that point. That 1 point is what's definitively putting them ahead of the Williams and the Haas cars. And even with 1 point being 8th rather than 9th or 10th can make a big difference in the money you get at the end of the season. And if he gets any more results like that, that's what is going to keep Giovinazzi in that seat next season.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Courtney, regarding Alfa Romeo, of course, we've said a lot on Giovinazzi. I'm going to ask you about Kimi Raikkonen this time around. Kimi, of course, he come 11th in the Monaco Grand Prix. So, of course, if something happened to someone else, he'd have gone into the points as well. Is there anything that Kimi Raikkonen really needs to do, or are you expecting anything from Raikkonen that he's not already doing? Because at the moment, it seems like he's very much living up to what he said in Drive to Survive last season, where he said he's doing it as a hobby. And despite that, he's still putting in the performances that Kimi Raikkonen isn't well known and loved for. So is there anything more that Kimi could do that Giovinazzi perhaps is doing at the moment?
I think Kimi's in a position where he can do whatever he pleases, obviously within reason. But I think at the same time, I think Alfa Romeo will want a level of experience when it comes to their team going into the future. So it is a straight playoff between Kimi Raikkonen and Giovinazzi. But you just feel that Kimi Raikkonen holds the power because of the status that he has in Formula One in general. So I think Giovinazzi's future very much depends on what Kimi Raikkonen chooses to do next season.
It could well be. I mean, and that's always a point to consider. Does Kimi have cards in his hand over what he can do with his future? I personally feel that from last season, Kimi was kept in Formula One for this season because the cars were being homologated a year to push back the 2022 regs. So obviously they wanted an experienced driver that was familiar with the current cars, whereas next season, with all brand new cars, everybody's got to learn them. It provides an opportunity for a new driver to come into the team from F2, for example, that doesn't have the steep learning curve that they would otherwise have coming in this season compared to the competition. But of course, we'll have to wait and see. There's no confirmation either what's going to happen with Raikkonen, but we'll just have to wait and see on that one. Let's go to Williams now. George Russell. There wasn't really much to say about Williams other than their 750th race, which of course they wouldn't have wanted it to go down the way it did, but they were very, very quiet last weekend at Monaco. Are we expecting another difficult weekend for George Russell and Nicholas Latifi, or do you feel that there's something that perhaps they may get a good result? Ruby, I'll ask you first on that one.
I think the most that George Russell is going to be wanting this weekend is a Q2 appearance, and at the very least being ahead of Latifi. That Williams seems to be absolutely nowhere in a race situation, although he was racing around at 11th at one of the Grand Prix, and he was going to overtake Valtteri Bottas on merit in Imola, which would have certainly got him a point or two. But sadly, that we'll never know what was going to happen in Imola. But the Williams at the minute is very much lots of expectation, but I say expectation, potential, lots of potential, but zero deliverance unless something goes terribly wrong. Maybe we'll end up with an Azerbaijan Grand Prix this weekend that resembles the F2 season in 2016 when it started, and there were only a handful of finishers, which is what Williams would want. But I don't think it's going to happen at this point.
Well, I imagine in their wildest dreams, they may be hoping for a repeat of 2017, where Lance Stroll, the last driver to get a podium for Williams, managed to deliver. Then with that run down to the checkered flag with Valtteri Bottas, I'm pretty sure George Russell would probably be delighted coming third in that situation. Probably not to Bottas, mind you, but certainly getting on the podium. Courtney, what do you make of Williams' prospects for Azerbaijan? Do you feel that there's any chance that they're going to be able to get near the front or get into the points perhaps? And perhaps for George Russell, as Ruby's already pointed out, had a few classic moments. The one in Imola probably would have got a bit better in the mind of others if it didn't end the way it did. But is there something more that perhaps George could do for Williams that could really put him in the Mercedes ballpark? Or do you feel he just has to keep doing what he's doing, getting into Q2 on a regular basis?
I think Williams is just going to have to rely on an exceptionally chaotic race. They really are in no man's land at the moment. They were showing signs of promise in pre-season and at the very start of the season. And I really do feel sorry for George Russell, because it seems that even compared to last season, it just seems that he's not able to showcase what he can do on a regular basis. And it's damaging for him at this stage of his career. So I can't see them pulling anything out of the bag in this race. Unless we have an exceptional race, I think it's going to be another quiet race for them.
Yeah, it's hard to get invested in what's going on at Williams at the moment. They're definitely thinking long term, and perhaps that's what we have to go with. Just be patient and hope that when the new rules come into place, Williams will have a much better go at it, as they have done in this turbo hybrid era, where they've obviously steadily regressed to being at the very back of the field, considering they started off as the second best team behind Mercedes in 2014. Let's finally stop off at Haas. There's not really too much to say on them at the moment. Of course, they had a good weekend by their standards at Monaco. Both cars finished, and they put in together, they finished higher than they would have normally done at most tracks, 17th and 18th. Surprisingly, Mazepin finishing ahead of Schumacher for the first time this season. But on the subject of Mick Schumacher, Ruby, what have you made to his start with Haas? He's had some good moments, but on occasion, as we saw in Imola, and of course we saw in qualifying in Monaco, he has had moments where he's perhaps pushed a little too hard and made that mistake. Is that something that you're giving leniency towards and expecting the rookie mistakes to happen now? Or do you feel that this is something he needs to address sooner rather than later?
Well, I do think if you are going to make rookie mistakes, the likes that Schumacher has been making, you make them in a car when no one is expecting anything of you. This Haas, the fact that it has finished ahead of some cars at some races, more specifically only with Schumacher doing that, that's an achievement in itself. We saw, I mean, I'm pretty sure every single person who was ever cheering for Michael Schumacher was cheering when Mick Schumacher overtook Latifi in a Williams. But at the same time, he's in the George Russell situation of last season. A very promising rookie gets put in a car that's nowhere with a teammate who many people are questioning involvement in F1 other than just money. There is obviously a lot of expectation that we're just not going to get anything special this season.
No, and that's a fair point. I think we have to, understand that he's going to be in the slowest car. So that pass on Latifi could turn out to be the highlight moment, not just for him, but for Haas this season. With that being said, it's really hard to kind of judge how good Mick Schumacher not just is right now, but how good he's going to be. Although I think we could agree that Mick is learning at a faster rate than he has done in his junior career, where he's often needed at least a season to actually get on top of things for the season that follows. Where do you see Mick Schumacher in terms of where he is right now, ability-wise, and what potential he has? Where's the upper limit in your mind? I mean, is it a push to say that he could have some success like his dad did, or do you feel that perhaps we're thinking way too high up for him?
I think it's obviously going to be something that comes in a couple of years at the very earliest. Ferrari have very much got their seats locked down with Sainz and Charles, and Ferrari have obviously very much pinpointed that Charles is Ferrari's future. But, Schumacher, as you said, took a couple of seasons to get up to speed in F2. This season, it's hard to tell where he is, but he has at least consistently, with the exception of Monaco, finished in some cases laps ahead of his teammate. If he is going to be around, he's either going to be in that top half of the field, or maybe even the pinnacle. But I do think it will be with a Ferrari power team rather than anyone else.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And of course, we should ask that question because it's so hard to tell. There's so many great drivers in the sport right now. Talent and depth wise, it's probably as good as it's ever been. So it's so much harder for Mick to really stand out, even with a name like Schumacher, of course, which a lot of people were getting on board with. But he's certainly, at this point in time, living up to it in some capacity. Courtney, with Haas as well, are you expecting anything from them? And how do you judge what Mick Schumacher is doing at the moment? Do you feel that he should be concerned about crashes like he's been making at Imola and Monaco, or do you feel that's just a part of the learning process for him that he needs to get over?
I think it's worth highlighting once again the character development that we saw from Nikita Mazepin for not actually getting in people's way at Monaco. So well done for that. That's always a start. So I expect to see more of that from Haas getting out of people's way because they're so far behind. And for Mick Schumacher, it's so tough. That car is so dreadful. It really is dreadful. I just think this season just should be an opportunity for him actually to learn the ins and outs of Formula One when the eyes aren't actually on you, because they're so obscure as a team. But this could actually be an opportunity for him because there's so little pressure. Just learn the ins and outs of Formula One and hopefully get himself a move to a team higher up the grid. Then, because sometimes you can learn from being in a really bad team. We've seen it with some of these drivers in the past. We saw it with Fernando Alonso when he was at Minardi, for example. Teams that were so bad, but with bad experiences are still experienced nonetheless. So I reckon he should just take stock from this season, pick up what he can, and then hopefully next season or so he can get a move to a bigger team, because I don't see much of a future for Haas. I really don't.
Yeah, and that's always the worry. Hopefully for them, it doesn't go out that way, but of course, we'll just have to wait and see. So yeah, I'm aware of time. So I'm going to make this last part very, very brief because obviously, Ruby, I don't want to keep you up too long. But I'm going to chuck some race predictions or requests, I should say, your way. So Ruby, give me your top three and what surprise prediction? Is there a surprise prediction for this weekend?
I'm going to be at least consistent with my grid talk predictions for this weekend. So I think top step, Lewis Hamilton. I've said a couple of times in this race podcast, I'm expecting him to bounce back in true Lewis fashion of, being the best of the weekend. Rounding it up, Ham Ver because that's obviously going to happen. So Verstappen being second, because as long as he finishes, I think he'll be the second best driver this weekend. And then Norris for third. I'm expecting a good result from McLaren, and apparently not a good result for either of the two rear gunners for the top two teams.
And is there a surprise prediction, something outrageous for this weekend?
The fastest lap from outside the top 10 finishers.
And who do you think that will be?
Potentially Fernando Alonso or someone along those lines. I just think he might just be like, we're nowhere in this race, and everyone up ahead is so close that they're not going to consider, making that second stop. Well, I don't know what the strategy will be this weekend, but an extra stop. So why not steal a point? Well, not steal a point, but prevent another team getting a point.
Yeah, I mean, whoever it's going to be is going to need a ridiculous tow from someone in DRS. It probably will come from an overtake at some point, as we saw a few years ago with Ricciardo. I think he overtook 3 cars in turn 1, and he got the fastest lap while doing it with that triple DRS and slipstream. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think fastest lap has played its part this season, and there seems to be that tactic where the bigger teams tend to find a gap in the midfield to try and put their car in where they don't lose a place. I'm not sure they're going to get that luxury this weekend, assuming things go to plan. Courtney, again, I'm going to come to you as well on this one. What's your top 3 for this weekend, and what's your outrageous prediction for this race?
Yeah, sorry, Rubio, I'm going to copy you and go with the top 3, because that was the top 3 I did have in mind. So yeah, Lewis first, Verstappen second, Norris third. I really expect a strong weekend from Lando. And in terms of outrageous, perhaps, I'm expecting another strong weekend from Aston Martin. Like, look at the specifics of that track, and hopefully Sebastian Vettel can take a lot from that. And I'm expecting a strong result from Sebastian Vettel.
Yeah, that's it. That's what I like to hear. Seb Vettel, top 10 maybe. Yeah, I think that's fair. I will probably, you know what? I'm not going to complete the trend on this one. I feel like flexi wings, this debate, because it's had so much talk and everything else, it's going to play a part. I just got this funny feeling it's going to play a part again. So I'm going to go Verstappen to win by virtue of this flexi wing thing, just ahead of Lewis and Bottas in third place. I just think Mercedes are going to be strong, but for some reason, I just got a funny feeling Verstappen's going to get it. I'll probably be wrong. Every time I said Verstappen's going to win, I'm wrong. So I said Lewis is going to win in Monaco, and I proved to be wrong. So yeah, don't listen to me if you want to bet on Formula One races, guys. That's all I will say. My bold prediction, I'm going to copy you, Courtney. I'm going to go with Seb Vettel to get points for Aston Martin. Yeah, I think that's probably a good way to round it off. So thank you, of course, Ruby, who I've kept up a bit longer than I imagined she would have hoped for coming on this episode of the DNF1 podcast. As I said before, guys, if you want to see more content from Ruby, her channel will be in the description below. And of course, she does host the Grid Talk podcast via the Race F1 Chronicle. So I will include that as well. So thank you so much, Ruby, for joining us on this episode.
Thank you, Ruby.
Thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed it.
It's been certainly fun. We'll have to have you on more episodes in the future. Of course, probably not as long as this one, but nonetheless, still be good to have you on. But with that being said, guys, as always, thank you so much for tuning in. And of course, if you have enjoyed this episode, please like the video and consider subscribing to the podcast on YouTube. We're very close to 400 subscribers. Please help us get along to get our next milestone. And of course, as always, guys, please stay safe. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. Take care.
See you soon.
Bye.